Hello and good morning, everybody. I want to welcome everybody to this fifth seminar in the Stop Far Right series. Stop Far Right is an Irish Research Council funded project led by Barry Cannon of the Department of Sociology at Maynooth University in association with Crosscare. The project aims to promote discussion and debate between academics and civil society groups on how best to counter-strategise against the growth of the far right in Ireland. This fifth seminar in the series will examine the impact of the far right on civil society and how local communities and civil voluntary groups can strategise against the growing influence of the far right in Irish communities. And our esteemed panel of speakers are Mark Malone, who has been active within social movements for social, economic and ecological justice over the last 2 decades. This has included work in community education, anti-racism, tax and debt justice, and the intersection of international development and development education. More recently, this work has focused on understanding reactionary right-wing movements and the ways and means by which communities and civil society might better equip itself. Theresa O'Donohoe lives in Lisdoonvarna, County Clare, where she first came to the attention of the far right in her role facilitating the community response to the proposed direct provision centre there. It emerged that the village had links with the extreme far right who were leading a call to quote unquote save Lisdoonvarna from the quote unquote great replacement. Theresa and other volunteers were targeted for their work coordinating a welcome for asylum seekers. She has written an insight into the tactics of the far right in Lisdoonvarna and what she has observed since then. Her book is in the final stages of publishing and should be available in the spring of 2022. Sarah Clancy is a poet, activist and community worker from Galway City, although she now lives and works in County Clare, where she's the coordinator of the Clare Public Participation Network. She's been involved in many campaigns over the years, including campaigns for environmental justice, bodily autonomy, marriage equality, and most recently, the ongoing campaign to end direct provision. With her colleague, Vicky Donnelly, she coordinated the design and delivery of the campaign strategies module, which is part of the MA in Public Advocacy and Activism in NUIG. My name is Shane O'Curry. I'm the director of INAR, the Irish Network Against Racism, and I have the honor of chairing today's proceedings. I was asked to step in to replace Riyad El Muslimani from Crosscare, who was to do this. So you will forgive me if I'm a little rusty as I get up to speed on this, but I'm really looking forward to this very rich discussion. So the format of today is that I'm going to ask each of the speakers to set out their stall for 5 minutes. We will then have a full-blown conversation among panelists until 12 o'clock, after which we will open up for questions and answers from participants. And so, you know, your questions and answers, please, I think you should have a little, in Zoom, you should have a questions and answers facility there within which to put those questions and answers, and they'll be moderated. As you know, this webinar is being recorded and is being live streamed to Facebook right now, and will also be shown on YouTube later on. So without further ado, I might ask the speakers to set out their stall for 5 minutes each. And I'm just going to go in the order that I have in front of me. So I'm going to ask Mark Malone. Mark, if you wouldn't mind starting us off with your stall.
Hi Shane, thanks very much for that introduction. To the colleagues at Maynooth and to Theresa and Sarah, yeah, it's great to be here. I guess in terms of setting out a stall as such, and interrogating perhaps how we and what we can be doing to better understand and undermine kind of far right organizing. This is something I guess that I'm kind of coming to relatively recently in terms of digging into sort of how we better understand and define as well as counter kind of far right organizing. And I'm really looking forward to the contributions from Sarah and Theresa in terms of their own kind of experience. One of the things I can kind of been trying to tease out more recently, and I guess apologies if some of this doesn't come across as like completely like I'm talking as an expert. I'm not an expert in this stuff, right? But I think in terms of how we collectively and sort of in spaces where we work, where we organize, how we challenge kind of far right and fascist kind of organizing is better equipped, I guess, in terms of trying to understand the sort of processes and dynamics really of what far right, what we mean by kind of far right organizing, and also what we mean by kind of fascist potentialities. I think we kind of historically understand fascism perhaps in its historical roots of the sort of early and mid 20th century in Germany, Spain, Italy, and sort of the interwar and post-war kind of periods of World War I leading up to World War II. There's also a kind of lens by which sort of colonialism and an understanding of colonialism allows us to see the sort of the deep and long history of kind of white supremacism from the 15th century forward. How that internalization perhaps of like structural oppressive kind of violences and was internalized perhaps and partial of the function of how fascist movements kind of developed. I think as well, it's important probably to avoid historical determinism. So it's really clear, for example, that fascist, neo-fascist, or even post-fascist movements that exist now are not a complete reproduction of the past, but neither are they wholly new. And I guess the term far right itself tends to be a sort of use an umbrella catch-all kind of term, reaching from the kind of like hard conservative right to white supremacist YouTubers, to political organizations, to sort of, very sort of closed cell kind of neo-Nazi groups. And there's this sort of the experience in Ireland, given the relative lack of success of far right movements, even though there's something that's really important in the focus of work now. The lack of success perhaps itself lends us, the usefulness perhaps of looking elsewhere alongside our work of, trying to understand what exactly is happening now, is also looking at the experiences outside the state itself. One of the questions that often comes up is fascism against democracy versus fascism within democracy? And I think looking across different countries in terms of, Italy, Brazil, Hungary, Poland, it's really clear that fascist mobilizations are happening within democratic spheres. Likewise, the adoption of far right ideas within the sort of political organizations like the Conservative Party in the UK would suggest that those things they coexist. And that far right kind of mobilizing and more fascist tendencies exist within the kind of democratic states, perhaps itself. One of the kind of questions, I guess, that comes up really quickly whenever we talk about the far right, it's like, who are the fascists? Who are the fascists today? And I think that's an important question, but I think it's only part of the question we want to be asking in terms of better understanding and also making choices around the types of actions that we take in terms of demobilizing, demotivating, and disrupting kind of far right organizing. I think maybe some sort of questions that might sit alongside that are quite useful is like, so how is fascism forming itself out of the disparate parts of the far right movement that currently exists? Or who or what is making the world more conducive to fascism now? And I think sort of looking at those sort of disaggregated, disparate parts, these questions kind of help us better understand the dynamics. It asks us sort of to interrogate variated kind of processes by which people can engage in far right and fascist organizing itself, like publications, online trolling, political organizations, the impact of specific communications technology, the sort of close proximity nowadays, I guess, of like hard right reactionary Catholicism in some spaces in Ireland with explicit fascist propagandizing, as well as kind of party organizations, organizational formations, internal tensions, all those types of things that are useful to interrogate to help us better make choices about how we intervene, really. Sitting alongside that as well, and within that interrogation, it's probably worth saying that like a significant amount of like fascist and far right activity isn't effective. A lot of it isn't making the world more conducive to far right movement building. Indeed, sometimes it's doing the exact opposite. So I think taking a step back and removing more ourselves specifically from the question of like, who are the actors, which gives one set of answers. I think sort of having a sort of variated understanding, an approach to kind of trying to tease out some of those dynamics for whatever would give us kind of a richer kind of analysis in order to take types of action, you know. One of the things I guess that I'm kind of interested in at the minute is a fascist feelings and the types of emotional landscape perhaps that are integral to people's kind of subjective self, how they understand themselves within, you know, late capitalism, the sort of recurring kind of crises that we have, and the extent to which and the ways that far right kind of mobilizing utilizes kind of experiences of hate, alienation, inadequacy, how it kind of replenishes those feelings in order to give themselves kind of, you know, kind of a attraction. I guess another part of why kind of feelings and emotions are important within far right organizing is that there's a quasi kind of imaginary role within far right and fascist organizing that's really central. You know, it's not because fascists are particularly imaginative in and of themselves. Like all social movements, all political movements require kind of and have a kind of imaginary in and of themselves. But one of the reasons it's so important within sort of far right and fascist organizing is that they don't have a material basis or understanding. So if you take, for example, you know, our understanding of like left organizing on a concept of kind of class struggle, or if you look at a kind of more social justice kind of focused lens that looks at like struggles of the oppressed and the marginalized, those have a material basis. Whereas the sort of the rhetoric and sometimes the drive within far right movements themselves, or this quasi imaginary, this sort of fake history, you know, so the stuff that we talk about, like the real Irish, harks back to this imaginary time that didn't really kind of exist, you know. And so thinking through how far right organizing mobilizes and utilizes, I guess, emotion is kind of key. Also, I think there's a third point, which is that at an emotional level, recruitment requires very often isolation from kind of family members, from friends, and the creation of kind of mythical communities around, I guess, mythical kind of ideas. And better understanding perhaps some of those processes, I guess, lends itself to sort of interventions around kind of de-radicalization, but also kind of convincing people that actually their politics, getting involved in this stuff, the politics of it, the hate, the isolation, the sort of internal tensions around perpetual hopelessness that sit around kind of vacuous notions of power, that they're kind of dead end game to a large degree. You know? Those, I guess, are just some of the questions that I'm going to stop there because I'm running way over time. There's some of the questions, I guess, that I think might be useful, and I'm trying to dig into myself, I guess, in terms of better understanding. You know, I'm going to leave that there for
now. Thanks very much, Mark, for that really insightful, quite high level, but also very detailed digging into what questions we should be asking and what are they, and what are the issues that face us. Yes, I really like the way you addressed without answering the very difficult question of the typology of the far right. How do you define the far right, and how do you define the different elements within it, and a, you know, very nuanced understanding of the far right as neither something being something that's entirely new, neither or being a clone of its past iteration. And then I think really, I mean, the thing that really jumped out at me was was one of your last points there is the imaginary. You know, the far right has been kind of what Anderson's calls an iteration of nationalist ideology, the reproduction of an imaginary community, but one that is completely unrooted in any material understanding of how history works, and so able to be perpetually lost, and how far right strategies, for the far right quote unquote community will inevitably lead to the alienation of its members, and I think you correctly identify those as two potential weak points to which we must address ourselves. So I really found that very fascinating. So just thanks very much for that. That's given me a lot of food for thought. I'm going to pass on now so that I'm not monopolizing to Theresa. And Theresa, I would, if you would like to set out your stall and speak to Mark's point at all, if you think it's relevant, over to you, Theresa.
Thanks, Shane, and thanks, Mark. And yes, I would say high level sums it up. I came into this not having a clue who the far right was, anything about fascism. My whole genre for being an activist in the first place is climate action, and that led me down the road towards democracy and realizing that we needed a much better democratic process locally in order for communities to be able to take climate action. And then while I'm living in Lisdoonvarna, and a few years ago there was the proposed direct provision centre here, and I wasn't going to get involved at all because I'm not, I considered I'm burnt out actually with climate action at the time. In the end, I did go to the second community meeting there was, which meant that I ended up facilitating because I was possibly less passionate about the whole situation in the first place. So I wasn't as animated as a lot of people were about the situation. Anyway, as time went on, it became apparent that there was a small cohort of people within the community who were making plans without the rest of the community. So the democratic deficit was there. These people were coming up with the ideas that they thought were right for all of us. And this all started to come out over time. But my meeting with the Far Right was online on Facebook, where they took a screenshot of the group we set up to welcome asylum seekers. And that then was created. They took a photograph of all of the people who were administrators on the group and kind of started discussing it on their own platforms as if though we were a hit list. And at this stage, about half of those volunteers left. They were afraid, very worried about what these people were going to do with them, to them, about them. And so we had ourselves in a situation where we were now being targeted by the far right. It also came to pass after a while, I don't know who alerted, possibly Sarah, because she knows so much more about fascists than I do, and the whole movement, that we actually have someone living in Lisdoonvarna who was one of the founders of Breitbart and very much involved in this inner circle, I call them, of this group that decided that they would pursue a path towards getting an injunction against the direct provision centre, unbeknownst to the rest of the community. And I think that's what's important here, is that there was a small group that were gone on their own trajectory. They were, I would say, they were privileged, the group that were this, it was people who had money and were concerned about their, I don't know, prosperity, basically. And so they pursued their certain path. But I think now that if I had known that that was happening at the same time that I was trying to weave a path of democracy and listening to what everybody else wanted and trying to facilitate that community response, if I had known that there was this other group from the start, I possibly may not have gone down that route. So I probably would have been intimidated by the group that were privileged, big names in the community, and they were steering a course I was oblivious to. I'd say most of the community were oblivious to. So that tactic, or I can't say it was a tactic, but that occurrence that we had no idea about, or I had no idea about this, meant that I soldiered on, facilitating in an open democratic process, what I thought was the way to do it. So that was a good accident, really. And so I've come to the democratic deficit, to me, is a lot of the problem here. We were told, the community was told they were getting this direct provision centre. We were totally left high and dry by the government. And that just fertilised the ground for the far right. And that's continuing to happen. The democratic deficit across this whole country is allowing radical people come in and claim ownership of people's they're upset, and every cause they have is being sucked up by the far right as, we care about this and you can be part of our soldiers. And that's worrying. And I think we need to start addressing the democratic deficit, and especially when you're talking about the isolation. So people become involved and then they become isolated. If we're actually looking at this at a more community and more on the ground level, there's less chance of that happening. You know, I think the more open we are and the more democratic we are in our own communities, the more we're aware of this happening. Maybe it would be nipped in the bud, hopefully, and then COVID doesn't help. I'm trying to think what other, seeing as it's a stall, I didn't bring my homemade crafts. So the yeah, I think one of the one things that because I'm not into any of the far right, far left fascism or anything like that, and this was all new to me, I assumed that the guards would be the people who would look after us, you know, and like, hello, we're being targeted on Facebook here. We're worried these people. We had to tell people, don't give anyone directions to our house. We don't want anyone to know where we live, because we were worried that these people were going to come to Lisdoonvarna, look for us and lynch us or something. We were so worried. And we thought the guards might actually do something about this, but they didn't. And it was very clear early on that we were on our own, abandoned by the government, who were just allowing this, you know, here you go, there's a direct provision centre. Oh, we don't care what sort of attention you're getting. Abandoned by the Gardaí because there's nothing they can do about it. And then watching social media drill, you know, regurgitate all of this and add to it, and wondering who the hell is on our side here and how can we deal with this? So that was kind of the start of the whole journey of getting to know a bit more about the far right, and that's possibly the rest. The rest is history, I suppose.
Thanks very much, Theresa. I think that was a really good follow-up to Mark's high-level analytical piece. It was your very much, you know, ground level telling of your praxis, essentially, you know, where you know, you're testing your expectation that there would be a democratic process, and you know, and finding that there isn't, that there is, as you call it, the democratic deficit or a democratic void, which is very successfully exploited by people with power and influence and an agenda, who are able to step into that void with pre-prepared answers, which have been concocted and prepared in a back room, designed to drive a wedge between people, and very quickly create the conditions where you know, activists with a humanitarian impulse are intimidated, and you know, as you say, find themselves on a hit list, and then you're shocked and surprised at the lack of response from the Department of Justice and from An Garda Síochána to either protect you or to address the conditions of this void, you know, around the lack of consultation around the setting up of a direct provision centre. And as you say, it was a fast learning curve for you. And had you known in the beginning what this would involve, you might not have become involved. For one, I'm very grateful that you did become involved, because you have become such a formidable fighter against this, and the analysis that you're producing is very rich in lessons for all of us, and I'm very much looking forward to your book. So I just want to thank you for that, and pass on to Sarah Clancy to pick up the baton there. Please, Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation to be here this morning. We've survived the storm out here, but I suppose the storms of fascist organising are continuing. So I might come in roughly somewhere between Mark and Theresa there, and that's I suppose a lot of my interest around this is what actually works, you know, what are the nuances, what works to combat it, how we can address it and so on. So just, you know, in terms of that, as in, I was also involved, as Theresa mentioned, I work in County Clare, and so one of the things that has been happening is that there's been quite a focus around, for want of a better word, what I'll call rural grievance has been seen as a site of struggle for the far right. And by rural grievance, I don't mean whinging country people. I mean things like, for example, I'm remembering the first time I saw actually direct far right organising around migrants in Ireland. The first time I saw, you know, kind of this particular phase of it was at the proposal to open an Iraq reception centre in Ballahadreen in County Roscommon. And so people from the far right had gone around distributing flyers and so on. And some people brought those flyers to my attention. Now, one of the things that happened there, right, and this is by way of understanding it, that without a community being any way racist whatsoever, there was a hotel there in Ballahadreen that had lain idle because of the crash. And the community had been told that the hotel had been sold and was going to reopen. So the community that was there, which is very, very poorly serviced and very poorly resourced in many ways, had this idea that they were going to have a hotel and leisure centre in their town, which would be available for functions, for gym, for swimming and everything, you know, for all the kind of, I suppose, a private establishment providing what might be seen as essential community services. But they were very glad at the prospect. And then so the far right walked there straight into this idea that the local community, having very poor services anyway, was now about to lose the prospect of it having a hotel. And then they began to try and manipulate that around towards antipathy to the idea of the centre opening at all. No, they failed there. I don't know if everybody remembers, but they failed there, and they failed badly because the community actually were just, you know, they were really decent people, and they were able to to separate their, you know, their disappointment around the hotel and the lack of services in their community from the plight of the people who were mostly coming from Syria at that time to be established in the hotel. But that's the first time I saw them identify actually this locating of asylum seekers and refugees in rural areas as a potential site of struggle. And the next time I saw it was Lisdoonvarna. Now, like, one of the things to think about there from my point of view is that, you know, rural communities are not prototype fascist communities. You know, they're not. Most of our, like, I know from working in Clare, any single time we we have somebody in need, or we need people to come out in support of, say, you know, a community situation, we'll be inundated with support. So there's people there. It's a very charitable model that exists. It's not necessarily based on kind of, you know, it's not necessarily based on an understanding of class and justice, but it's definitely based on an understanding of that when people are in need, we'll help them. So there's two things happening there. There's rural isolation, and there's also the ability of rural communities to come to the aid of someone who is in trouble in their midst. And so those are two things. One is available for I suppose, fascist actors to try and tap and maneuver into a, you know, I suppose, maneuver into a protest and a resistance against a kind of a self-sufficient rural protest against the government imposing things, which is why, which is why government practices such as opening rural direct provision centres in rural places has to be really examined apart at all from the experiences of those who reside in them. And then there's the second thing, there's the ability of us in rural communities to really mobilise quite quickly around, in ways that are maybe more self-sufficient than in urban areas, around making something happen because we want it to happen. So those I think are the factors. I know that's probably not clear, but those are the factors within which the anti-fascist organising was happening in rural Ireland. I saw at close hand, I saw in Kinvara and in Ennis, and then in Milltown Malbay, I saw different aspects, all relating to direct provision centres or emergency centres for asylum seekers. We saw different reactions. So we saw a community in Milltown Malbay go absolutely out of its way to welcome people and, you know, welcome people into their homes and support them. However, they were unable to compensate for the actual living conditions in the awful emergency centre that was there. And so that later then divided the community, because one part of the community began to campaign to have the centre closed, and the other part of the community felt, you know, that they had really supported, and that the presence of the people there was a real benefit to them and the community. So real nuances and, you know, tricky arguments emerged in those situations. But to bring it back to the far right, one of the things that we learned is creating a positive alternative space for organising is a really efficient tactic. The politics of it may have to be questioned, and we can say much more about that at times. But one of the things that, rather than necessarily fighting the far right on the internet, fighting them at public meetings, that creating a space in which people who have goodwill towards what is happening can organize, take action, and making that space be the noisier and more dominant space worked really, really well in Milltown Malbay. It worked really, really well in the face of opposition in Ennis, and it worked really well in Kinvara. Now, I just want to make it clear that I'm not claiming that work. Loads of people did that work, but as a tactic, providing a space for the vast majority of people who are not fascist, who don't want to be involved in racism and who don't want to be involved in that type of thing, providing a space for them to publicly take action was probably the most critical and useful, although occasionally politically suspect thing that we have found that has worked so far. I think I'll leave it out there for now. And if we have, you know, in the discussions between us, we might have more to say and more to tease out about, you know, the nuances of that. And other than that, I'm looking forward to hear what everybody else has to say, and also the questions as well.
That's great, Sarah. Thanks very much. And as usual, your very sharp analysis there. And as you say, a kind of a mid-level analysis between the high level and the grassroots, taking a long view from a rural perspective. Very interesting, your identification of rural grievance, of rural isolation, the underserving of communities by government as providing a backdrop, again, a void into which the far right will attempt to get a foothold and to exploit that. But also your very quick assertion that rural communities also possess tremendous strength in their ability to mobilize in self-sufficient ways and in the instinct towards human decency and solidarity as a counter to that. And really the examples that you've held up of tactics that have worked or strategies that have worked very well by activists in several communities in creating positive spaces for organizing, which, as you say, as an alternative for the negative space within which the far right operate, and the space that which you applaud for making things noisier. I do like noisy things, so that's really great. So I might just then come back and ask Mark, just to pick up on that last point. Do you have any reflections on? I know that you and I traveled to Carrickmacross and we met with some activists there some months ago. Do you have any thoughts on that strategy of creating a positive space for organizing? And if we I know that Sarah sort of left a caveat there saying that this strategy isn't without problem, So
Yeah.
yes, and I think we should put on our cameras. Yes, I would
Yeah.
suggest that, Sarah. So do you have any reflections on that?
I mean, I guess as a culture, right? As someone who kind of grew up in a kind of rural community, like it resonates really strongly that actually what holds people together is a sort of, if not couched in the language of left politics, our community is very much a lot of the time in terms of social solidarity, collective care. You have kind of, you know, both family kind of networks. Not to say that communities aren't without their kind of tensions, particularly where I grew up, but also just more generally. That's not to erode the sort of the stratification around class and sort of social power and status that sometimes plays out. But I think at the same time, like the sort of a general kind of sense, perhaps, that I mean, my experience is that communities tend to be not just welcoming, it's like they're caring, you know, so it's like the word welcoming, I guess, is in terms of like people kind of coming into the community from new, but I guess more generally, like I find this kind of caring spaces. Now, that's not to overgeneralize, right, or not to as I say, to create invisible or to disown the fact that there are kind of divisions. And in that context of I think there's a usefulness. I mean, in the same way that the far right appeal to kind of emotions, I don't think it's an appeal to emotion of like social solidarity is based in care, right? It's around love, care, and solidarity are kind of very kind of grounding base attributes, you know. In terms, it's quite interesting. Like one of the there was one of the last kind of partisans in Italy, like you know, was recently chatting about Salvini, and they couched it purely in the terms of like this rage and indignance at the rudeness, you know. So it wasn't a long polemic about you know, the politics of far right or far left or, you know, anything else. It was just like this is pretty miserable, disgusting human behavior to go around that. No, that's not going to appeal to everybody. That's not a strategy in and of itself. But I think it's useful to remind ourselves what it lies at the core of the types of things that we're kind of resisting and how we might be able to explain that to others. Often, you know, described as perhaps the politics of hate, the politics of rejection. I'll leave that there for now.
Great, Mark. Thanks. Theresa, how much of an asset is this, you know, instinct for human decency and kindness, and are there limitations to us over relying on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's been most important. As Sarah says, you know, the capacity within the community. I mean, what happened in this environment was amazing. The amount of well-meaning, caring people that came forward and mobilized behind the direct provision, behind the situation, was just amazing. And I would agree about having a safe space for people to do that. How we create those safe spaces, it comes back to the democratic process. And that said, even in the space where we were in this environment, the people who took upon this role to be the voice of the community behind everyone else's back would have been seen to be the democratic voice of the community. So how do you do it that the true voice of the community is involved in the democratic process? So I think it's a lot more about, you know, messier maybe, that more people have to be involved in it. There has to be more accountability. There has to be more transparency in how decisions like that are being taken and who's involved in this. I mean, we had a vote. I don't know, I forgot to mention the vote. But I mean, we tried to do the democratic route, which was a vote. And I think, you know, people might even have voted on, do you want asylum seekers? You know, it was all about how you worded the vote at that stage, because the outcome was, I knew people weren't against asylum seekers, most people anyway, but we did have that far right agitator in the community who I would say used the situation to gather more support for the far right in Ireland, and probably got funding in to support the far right in Ireland because of their positioning. So we were lucky.
If I could just come in on that, Theresa, because, you know, one of the things there's an actual far right tactic that's happening there quite often, for want of a better word, quite often on the left. We have complicated stances on things, right? So the left, right, the role of the so-called left or progressive people in university environment or around a direct provision centre is very complicated, because we absolutely did not want a direct provision centre where people would be put in isolation in rural Ireland and left warehoused, you know, as part of the direct provision system, which discriminates and promotes a form of apartheid. You know, so nobody wanted that to happen, because it is an abuse of the human rights of those within it. So so the complicated circumstance that emerges then is to go, how do we differentiate our opposition to the direct provision centre from the opposition of those who are agitating around the same issue as we are on some of the same grounds, right? On some of the same grounds that this is the state forcing things onto rural communities and everything. So how do we differentiate those nuanced points of view? And that's what really came up, that's what really came up in Lisdoonvarna, and I would say was the first site of, an attempt to really manipulate the process by the far right, although to our great advantage, they were only beginning. They've honed their tactics since, as you would see in Lisdoonvarna. So if you look at the vote, the vast majority of people that we knew, there absolutely was racism in the hall in Lisdoonvarna at that meeting. There absolutely was racism. There was overt racism. There was a well-known restaurateur there was mentioning that people were refugees and, like really awful things. So let's not idealize that, there's no racism in rural communities. There absolutely was racism there, but the vast majority of people there were something substantial was happening in their community without which they hadn't been given information properly for it. They were being fed misinformation about it, and it was also a complicated circumstance. So it was where a community that might mobilize around welcoming and supporting newcomers was being asked to do so in a way that most kind of right-thinking people wouldn't have thought was a proper way to accommodate people who may have experienced trauma and who are outside of their country of origin and so on. So that's the trouble we have, is that the right simplifies all the time. It simplifies, whereas the issues actually are complicated. So like if you look at it, you nearly need to draw a map of that. So there needed to be protest against the government's actions in Lisdoonvarna because it was continuing the profit-driven location of groups of vulnerable people in remote locations without the services that they needed, mostly for the benefit of a local hotelier, without the community concerns. There was the local community which wasn't given proper information about what was happening. Now, I'd be very reluctant to think that we should be allowed to have a vote on who lives beside us, but that's not an argument for lack of proper information and understanding. And then there were those who, basically just would oppose change. And I mean, that's a large number in any community because change is unknown. So we're asking people to leap into the unknown. They didn't know. And so that's like, if you look at that, you nearly need a Venn diagram. So there's a situation that has to be managed. And once bad actors come into that situation, for want of a better word, I'm calling the far right bad actors, is highly overcomplicated because nobody can stand there defending what the government is doing. Nobody can go, no, this is an awesome idea, we're 100% in favor of this, whereas the far right is able to go, we're 100% against this, and also not accountable for any information that it provides, and I think those are like those are ways in which to look at it. And I mean, I know that's again, I'm coming slightly between Mark and Theresa, so it's against, it's rather than like the big analysis of who the far right are, but also the lived experience, people's feelings, people's fear. You have to manage people's fear, and Mark is 100% right when he said one of the things that the far right is doing, it's creating emotion, inclusion, dynamism, and enthusiasm, which are things that we absolutely want to do on the left, but the right is managing to do them in certain circumstances where the issues are too complicated for us to have a simple position. I think that's like, if I have a big doubt, that's where it is at the moment, is in how do we get people to engage with complicated issues and still come down on the right side of them.
If you can come in there, like you can see that playing out in sort of conversations and kind of organizing today, right? Two things that come to mind would be housing. So productive line, I guess, from the far right is like housing ours first, based on a really simplistic notion of like supply and demand without any kind of context. Equally, we're seeing like that play out within the sort of wider social anxiety and sort of public discontent around kind of like frustration around like COVID restrictions and is this kind of going to end? And essentially coming out with narratives now around, well, this is just a means of kind of social control. And one of the things that's probably changed over the last 10, 15 years was like, actually we could lay most of the sort of the social woes within the state at the foot of the state. And most of our kind of demands and campaigns and pushes were like looking for kind of recognitions and kind of redistributions from the state, the demand from successive governments around kind of policy change. And I think what the far right are kind of trying to successfully do is create, act in another space without that, which actually seems to, it deliberately tries to recategorize, for example, civil society actors, campaign groups as being, adjuncts of the state.
Mm.
So there's a move there where at an intellectual level is deeply incoherent and, as you say, bad faith, right? So it's, anybody like with any kind of analysis would kind of go like, look, the problem with housing in Ireland is not people coming in across the borders for housing, right? Questions around kind of demand kind of need to be answered, but the idea that like this has nothing to do with like long-term policies rooting back from like the 50s and 60s in terms of the state's housing. Likewise, with the more recent phenomena around like public health, right? Literally touching conversations of public health in the frame and lens with which this is about like the state trying to give increasing kind of social control, And I think it's worthwhile and illustrative to look at like who are the actors who are involved in recategorizing civil society organizations as being adjuncts in the state. That isn't just the far right. That also involves sort of the Christian hard right who are trying to roll back progressive wins that have happened already, who day in, day out try to deny any linkages with more extreme far right organizing in Ireland, and they do that vocally. We know the publications, we know the actors. However, what's of interest in terms of like some of the teasing out now, this bit of say, I guess historically there might have been looking at stuff that happens online and stuff that happens offline, right? I don't think those are useful kind of discrete categories anymore. I think sort of how public imagination and kind of discourse is being shaped is like in online spaces now you have a very close relationship with sort of hard Christian propaganda being pumped out by the actors that we know alongside far right kind of actors, all singing from the same hymn sheet saying, well, do you know what the problem are? It's the state, but it's also the sort of NGO class who are working alongside them to support this, like in our internal kind of victimization and our internal alienation, That's going off in a different direction, perhaps, but I mean, I think it's kind of it's useful to kind of understand the dynamics of play that's kind of allowing a recategorization of the work that we do in terms of like social justice struggles, pushing back against oppressions, and it's really useful and important today that we're discussing this in the context of like anti-fascist activity rather than just like bad hate or whatever. There's a kind of structural potentiality within some of these formations that can move very quickly whenever we look at what's happening overseas.
Thanks very much for bringing that up, Mark. In fact, because I had wanted to come back to you because in your introductory piece, you had spoken about the different players within it. And I think that, what you were speaking to is what some commentators call, the far right ecosphere and the different roles that different actors play in that ecosphere. So you have, your fascist groupings and your extreme right-wing groupings, and then you got your kind of radical right groupings, like the reactionary Christian or reactionary Catholic groupings and different interests. And I'm talking about bodies like Gript or Grift, as I like to call them. I've noticed, and I think you've just pointed out that they are singing from the same hymn sheet. So even though they might position themselves less unpalatably to the very far right in terms of the language they use, in terms of the way they describe different people, LGBTQI people, migrants and minorities and so on, they are speaking to the same talking points and dancing to the beat or to the same beat that the far right are dancing to very clearly. And I was just, so I'm really interested in exploring that point, and I'm just wondering whether Sarah or Theresa, from your experience, do you have any thoughts on this, or have you observed anything similar to that?
I would say again, it's coming from a rural perspective, but I would say that the Christian right, for what the Christian right versus rural Catholicism are not necessarily the same thing, like I suppose, as a queer person living in rural Ireland, I wouldn't be a huge fan of either, but at the same time, one is the fabric of society through which the dates and special occasions and everything are measured in rural communities. It's as much a culture as a religion. And the other one is an attempt to mobilize people through using their belonging to a certain group to mobilize them around certain stances. Now, the overlap here was I would say there was a very positive, in all the places I've been involved in, I would say there was a very positive, although charitable, intervention by religious forces around the issues of migrants, right? Now, so that just to say, now I could talk all day about aspects of that and what we need, how it in itself defends the status quo, but just to say, in terms of in the immediate circumstances, they would have definitely have been on the side of the people trying to welcome asylum seekers and refugees, whether that was by allowing us to use facilities, by so on. So that's just to say the ecosystem that I see, just to make it totally clear. One thing I think that we probably don't say often enough is that in Ireland, the people involved in trying to promote fascism in Ireland are linked to the absolute worst extremes of fascism globally, right? So we're not immune, So we see this guy, for want of a better word, right? You're going to have to bleep me now, but we see some little prick who's probably coming down trying to upset your community, but he is linked. He is linked across international channels that are resourced and have money, and that is where we don't get to dismiss them as little idiots, which I think we might have been inclined to do at the start, because they have access to powerful networks and tactics and strategists behind them, and I think that was completely apparent. I've just said that the same person that showed up in Lisdoonvarna showed up organising in Oughterard pretty shortly afterwards, showed up organising in Kinvara, showed up organising in Ennis, in each place trying to recruit and succeeding in recruiting really small numbers of people in each of those places. Now, I have a load of really funny screenshots for Kinvara where there was an internal discussion going on that they decided that Kinvara was too posh to be a site of struggle, and they had changed the name of the page in Kinvara, just for want of a better word, from Kinvara says no to, I don't know, enforced migration or something, to Kinvara says no to direct provision centre, to Kinvara says no to inhumane direct provision centre, and still weren't getting traction, So they were coming down through whatever tactics, like trying to masquerade as a human rights campaign in order to rope people in. But the idea, so there's one key player across there. Now there's two other people who you'd see, but like we've seen them up in as far as Carndonagh and Moville, where just to say, where criminal acts took place. We've seen them, the same thing in Ruski. And so while not to overestimate the advantage that we have in rural Ireland is that we live in these communities, whereas they're parachuting in. As long as we keep that advantage, I think we're okay. If they succeed in actually sufficiently organising within our communities, organising bases within our communities, then we have a different story. And that's what I would say in terms of, that's what we need to be looking at, is in how can those of us on the ground in rural communities ensure that that does not happen. And those I think that's maybe where a more tactical discussion happens, around about how, I suppose, how to do something other than fight people who might be at the beginning stages of, who might be just kind of almost innocently stepping into this stuff, where we draw the line between people need to be opposed and that people need to be kind of called back into our spaces. And I mean, those are really tricky things because they're hard, like.
Can I
really good last point. Yes, Theresa, I was about to ask you to come in.
Just now if I can remember it. Yes, naming their behaviour. I think that's really important, especially in rural Ireland, and that's why I chose to write a book, because I think people need to know what to look out for, or they can identify what's being done within their community. I think that's important, that is known to people. And I just want to go back to your man. I mean, it was really funny. Sarah, he doorstopped Sarah in work, in his phone, on his car, in his car. But now he has like 5,000 or 8,000 followers on YouTube, has state-of-the-art facilities and you know, microphones and things like that. So they're definitely resourced. I mean, I know that Breitbart here definitely did something to inject whatever was happening in Ireland. And that's, yeah, we do need to have tactics to counteract them, definitely.
And also systems of support. You know, I would just say, right, if you take that the very early stages of that situation, right? So just imagine, like, okay, so I already had some experience in these things, so it possibly was in that way I was lucky. But if you look at, they went on a kind of a slander campaign trying to say that we were nefarious actors. You know, they doctored photos of me as if I was given a fascist salute and circulated them all on social media. You know, your man came into my office demanding that we give him an interview because we're a publicly funded organization. But, you know, to be honest, I think I had a mixture of PMT and something on the same day. I was going, who is your man? I don't like him. But, you know, you know, it was just, but at the same time, I also would have been alert for some keywords for someone else mightn't have been. He was saying to me, I'm working for independent media. And I was saying, does it have any names? And he just said, you know, he happened to be so inept that he said, I think you should let me ask the questions here. And I was going, excuse me. You know, when you're going, it's in like, I said, if you're not prepared to tell me who you are, who you're working for, well then, you know, there won't be any interview happening, you know. But, and then, you know, he started using a few keywords by accident, saying things like, what do you think about floods of migrants? And, you know, just going, okay, that'll be all, thanks very much, you know. But like, you know, if you imagine if someone unsupported is in that situation, I know Mark has been in that situation and everybody has been. Say my board of management didn't, say they thought there was substance to this or there was something going on, I would have been in a different circumstance. So they were trying to threaten my livelihood. In the case of Theresa, and that they were trying to undermine her credibility in all kind of aspects of her life and isolate her from her community. Now, that's what I'm saying. They have got better at these things since. And that's how we need to, I think that's how we need to, things like the existence of the Far Right Observatory and, you know, other things where we publicly demonstrate their tactics. So in a way, we kind of vaccinate, for use of a great keyword, that we vaccinate or inoculate people against the tactics that are going to be used before those tactics are experienced. So say if something is going to happen, we say it's quite likely that you'll be on the receiving end of misinformation. Here are some good sources of information. That kind of thing has been, it has been working for us. Particularly, the one thing that I'm pretty sure of now, I'm not talking about not facing down people, but rather than getting into squabbles online where people have resources from countries all over the world that they can dedicate hours every day to fighting with you online about something, that putting the correct information out there in a form that's shareable from a trustworthy source and doing your best to get that shared seems to be much better to me than getting down in the trough, you know, as they say that, like, if you get down, all you get is mucky when you get down there, you know. But I think that's at the like, you know, the level at which we want to really kind of fight fascism. Most of our ordinary communities are not at that level. So even seeing us doing that may turn them off being involved with us. And that's something that I learned, you know, because I suppose I'd have a short fuse. And it's something that I learned is in terms of that going, I might be right, but I'm going to lose the people that I want to understand this issue there. So, and I mean, that's very unclear, but it's just.
Well, I likened it, when Mark started talking earlier, I likened it to speaking about climate change, because that's what I know. And you can turn everybody off immediately because they don't understand a word that you're saying. It's your everyday language, but they don't know. And even though I want to know more about the far right, I find it very difficult to understand the terminology because I just don't know enough about it. And I learned through experience, but I still don't know enough about it. And I think we do need to equip communities and people. But, you know, we were really lucky to have Sarah in our community. She was able to field it and explain what was happening to us. Most communities don't have Sarah in their community. Now we could plant Sarah everywhere. Now, you know, I'm still looking for this job they say I'm getting paid for.
Yeah, the money, the George Soros money, we need it.
Just to come in there, I guess, as well, right? So I think, like, so we kind of covered a bit of ground in terms of like the experience that they gather or whatever, you know, in reference to individuals. I think it's really important to flag as well, like, these people have, you know, they've loud mouths, you know, and there are people who are very amenable to like sharing information about what's going on in their spaces. They've also left really horrible digital crumbs, I guess, in terms of like the type of person that they are, right? Like in terms of like they try to mobilize elsewhere, it's not that difficult to kind of go, this is the type of people I'm talking about. This is what they say online, you know, laughing with their mates drunkenly about people getting murdered or different things they do, you know. Or for example, Philip Dwyer, one of the main organizers of the National Party in Dublin, running around, you know, getting filmed drunkenly, racially abusing a taxi driver, harassing women who are like campaigning for legislation around anti-stalking legislation, you know, complete clownery and buffoonery. So to a certain extent, and I think it's also important to recognize, like, or just to note, right, these people get minimal traction in the elections, right? So I think is to ensure that we do enough people, that we sort of, but also be able to speak like effectively and to share and communicate and discuss tactics in spaces that aren't online around how we kind of bring forward the kind of community knowledge that we're generating to sort of demobilize and to limit and inoculate. And that's not to minimize any of the stuff, but I would just to not overinflate the extent to which they're being successful, because
what you're doing, Mark, is amazing stuff. I mean, having that sort of as you say, digital fingerprint of what that person is like is amazing stuff, because I don't know their names, I don't remember their names, I don't know where they are or anything like that. To have somewhere to go that says, well, here's this person and this is what they're like, and Sarah did this as well in this environment, so that we had the evidence, because as a normal punter in the community, I didn't know where to go for that information, and now at least it's been gathered, and it's amazing to have that resource. You probably need another, how many staff?
I'd like to say, like, that work is distributed, right? And that's distributed across communities and distributed across the country, and it's kind of vital. And I think part of the work over the next, you know, couple of years is kind of like, well, how do we collectively benefit from all that? We make it more effective.
I think, I think it's just worth saying, it's just reiterating there that, they weren't successful in Lisdoonvarna, they weren't successful in Kinvara, and they weren't successful in Ennis. In particular, in both Kinvara and Ennis, they weren't at all successful. They just had to give up and go home, really. They only really managed to mobilize one or two people in the community. But I do think in a way, just that the idea, right? The idea of kind of, and this is around migrants, but the idea of, kind of welcoming committees of, people being able, one of the government strategy of isolating migrants and asylum seekers is feeding into the lack of spaces within which people can show their solidarity, So you actually have to build that space in order to do it. And that in a way, I think in almost any community in Ireland, you would be absolutely, I think you would be 100 to 1 for the people who would act to do something charitable to the people who would act to do something nefarious. I think you absolutely would be. But there's no space under the current system, under the government's current management systems, there's no space unless people willingly come together and do it themselves for the 100 to have an opportunity to demonstrate that they're the majority, and therefore a tiny minority can become vocal. And I think that's now that's just around that one specific issue. I don't want to, before we finish, I don't want to bring it down on a real downer note, but something that is right. So we've been talking here around, the location of migrants, the direct provision system, the asylum process. But one of the ways in which it's become more complicated now is that the exact same people who are organizing against migrants are now organizing against, vaccines, restrictions, 5G being inserted in your brain from your whatever. But they're also there, and they're having a new overlap now. And the new overlap that they're having is pretty well documented. I'm not saying anything new here, but is the kind of, homeopathic wellness alternative communities. And those are communities that had already chosen to forge their own path and may have a higher distrust of official information than other communities have. But they weren't, for the most part, communities that had anything to do with, like, most of them would have been involved in trying to live good lives on some level. It's a more individual form of that. than I, coming from, kind of coming from left politics, would really identify with. But it certainly wasn't an evil force. And I think that one of the things that we're looking at now is the complication of those links is giving us work, and we're going to have to be very careful about how to try and unlink those good people from the bad actors that are currently, making inroads. And I think that might be the work at the moment in a way,
I think that's getting through, though. I think by labeling it and naming it to people to watch out for these people has helped. That now they're trying to distance themselves from the far right, which is good. I also want to say that one of the I won't say coincidence, similarities between Kinvara and Ennis and this Kinvara is Sarah.
No, that's actually but that's actually just not true. Just to say, I absolutely hate to claim other people's work, but it was Vicky Donnelly who was behind the organising effort in Kinvara, and my colleague Sarah Farright. I'm great at starting things, but I always leave it to other people to do the work. So just to bear that in mind, starting a welcome group is one thing, but you need to be there the next week as well, and that's where I'm a bit weak on it. But catalyzing something to happen is one thing, but maintaining it is another thing. So, yeah.
I'm going to move us on now. We have a couple of questions, and I just want to encourage people to start asking some questions. We've got 3 or 4 questions, but actually the last point there that Theresa made in response to Sarah's commentary about the emergence, and the kind of the overlap between far right anti-vax, anti-mask discourse and the wellness community, and Theresa's response that you have to name these things. A thought that popped into my head is this: yes, you have to inoculate communities against these toxic discourses. Pardon the pun, but I'm going to move on to some of the questions, and I would encourage people to ask the questions. So that I'm going to maybe group them, and just one is standalone, and it's from Clare. It says, many thanks to all the contributors for their excellent tasks. Really interested in Sarah's reference to the term refugees, pardon the awful language. I'm wondering how important issues around crime and security are in this context. So do you want to, any comments on the on this sort of criminalizing of minoritized communities and this kind of stigma and the role it has to play in this?
Just one comment in terms of the circumstances that we were involved in. Fear of crime, I don't think was a factor other than when it was manipulated, right? So to just say, I didn't have any sense from any of the people that I've been talking to that when I heard those terms being used in the public meeting, it was one of the things that assured me that a rural community had been infiltrated by bad, that there was an attempt to try and manipulate because this language had been supplied. This isn't, people don't go around this to Varna using that language. It's not, they're not things. I remember someone saying to me, oh, there's no-go areas now in Sweden. And I was going, can you name me a town in Sweden? And you're just going, just for the crack, let's see how many areas you can name in Sweden before we decide whether that's accurate or not. And so in those terms, like I didn't see in Ennis, I didn't see even in the discussions where people were trying to stimulate them, I didn't see a real fear, a real association of an unfair and untrue association of migrants with crime as a factor there. It may well have been in more urban areas, like there's plenty of rural racism associated with rural crime, but that would be a topic for another webinar maybe than today's one.
Good point, Mark. Theresa, anything about that? Anything about the language?
No, but I agree with Sarah. This whole new language erupted in this Dunfermline and online, and sharing of videos of fighting and abuse and things like that. It was all brought in and fed to people. So.
Yeah. So then the other 3 comments are, I've got a comment from Duncan, from Ken, and from Niamh. They sort of resonate with each other. So, for Duncan, the far right historically appears to exploit and gain support at times of economic downturn. and there's a lack of provision, you know, where there is a lack of provision for local amenities. Ken says, I see Mark has just mentioned it, but opportunities for far-right recruitment. There's a conflation of perceived migrant threat and increasing housing precarity in Ireland. In terms of the delivery of public housing and communicating community cohesion and integration, do you think governments and local authorities need to communicate more widely and more assertively to challenge this narrative? And lastly, Neve's point, thanks to the speakers, for me it is about bringing clarity about how to untangle how the far right can gain a foothold in communities, while not forgetting the role of the state and the gaps emerging for the far right to fill. We don't have a magic formula to disrupt the far right on every issue around messaging. What measures, tools do we need to help activists and groups around the country identify what's happening so they can create or maintain positive spaces and feel empowered to do so? As the key tactic of the far right is intimidation and isolation of activists. If speakers have any thoughts. So is the three of them sort of flow from each other and speak very much to the discussion we've been having here. So I'll hand it over to you. Who wants to volunteer?
Well, I think the housing, well, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but definitely housing is one of the big arguments that's hard to argue because the housing policy in this country is so bad. And until that gets sorted out, I can see that until housing is kind of sorted out and healthcare, there's lots of problems for people to use as weapons against every move. You see it even with the climate crisis. Well, people are too busy. They're trying to find somewhere to live. It's very hard to engage people in the community when there's so many other issues going on. And I think until we start addressing people's need to survive or their basic needs, it's going to be very hard to have them politicized and mobilized against these forces coming in. So I think that needs to be addressed. Definitely, we need to have a better social life in this country before we can actually, we are taking on the far right, but we also need to have a much better democracy to be able to cope with this. And until that's sorted out, I think it's going to be a bigger battle.
Yeah,
Mark? Yeah.
Well, I would just say, I don't think the biggest issue is government messaging. I think it's the absence of kind of housing, right? And you will always have if you look at kind of like messaging around kind of welcoming people and then look at the practice of Frontex, if you look at what's happening in your border and the sort of criminalization of people seeking a better lives, fleeing wars, very many of them from fleeing situations created by Western interventions or by, you know, capital itself, as its normal workings, there's a contradiction in terms of that message, and then the government saying is kind of welcoming people, right? Sorting the housing is about sorting the housing, and I don't think that it's necessarily around. I don't think you know, obviously messaging is important. I don't think that's a solution to what we have, and I don't think that evacuates how far right we'll try to mobilize, I guess, around that. In terms of like messaging is kind of important, right? One of the tools and methods of far right mobilizing right now is kind of is mimetic kind of, you know, the categorization of people and ideas into, you know, via memes into like very simplistic kind of categories and responses, you know, and like the imposition of like trying to get people to think through your worldview or to hold for your worldview to become dominant. The use of memes is kind of part and parcel of that, you know, so categorizing people into chads, betas, whatever, categorizing relationships with women in this way, categorizing people of different sexualities in a particular way. You know, they're very, very, you know, relatively sophisticated perhaps, or they just exist now, means of like doing that categorization, whatever. So I think work around messaging is really important. Work around counteracting that is really important. There's always, I guess, the question around like sort of, you know, crisis being a space where the far right will mobilize. Like we're in a point in history where there are multiple intersecting kind of crises: ecological crisis, crisis of democracy, crisis of legitimacy in sort of institutions, crisis of capital itself and its ability to whatever, to reproduce, and the likely sort of push of a Cold War, for example, between the US and China, realignment of like from a hegemonic part of the US to whatever, our role in Ireland within that space. There's a multitude of overlapping and interrelated kind of crises going on. Yet at the same time, some of the work is reasonably kind of straightforward. It is the sort of demand for and push, you know, continuing kind of demands for like like better, if not total kind of redistribution of like power and wealth that's created. This sort of the attempting to redefine what types of society that we want to live in, that aren't kind of piecemeal. And I think one of the chunks of work is like those of us that work in kind of civil society and NGOs kind of spaces is actually starting to have a sort of bringing those kind of the conversations around kind of values into a more articulated vision of what we want, whereas and feeling kind of less siloed. And I guess in my experience in chatting to like folks working in different kind of areas, is the siloing effect of attacks by the far right, you know, and the demonization, the hassling, the sort of online trolling or whatever. It has a way of like organizations and people kind of feeling pulled into their own space. And I think some of the work is kind of is broadening back out again to be able to kind of articulate quite clearly like the demands that we have within the specific areas that we work, pushing back against the far right, but also contributing to that perspective of like what society can be in the midst of these crises, with ways of kind of finding kind of local based democratic kind of solutions that challenge the narratives that are coming out, I guess, from sometimes the government around housing, which are whatever, but also the narrative of the far right.
Can I just come in? So I read the questions, it's easier. So so about tools and measures that can be taken. I think it's really important for us to start looking at the messaging coming from social media, and the fact that people are allowed to continue doing this on social media is not good. I mean, it's just not fair. I mean, I'm still reporting Twitter accounts. I mean, that one there recently for this event, their actual account had loads of racism on it. And I reported that account and it wasn't stopped. It was, oh, we don't see why this actually does anything against the Gardaí. We should be allowed to feel safe if we're being attacked online or physically. If there's people coming into our community, which they did, the guards could do nothing. We need the hate crime legislation. We need them to start putting in new legislation that protects the people in the community that do actually step forward, because we lost half of the volunteers as soon as that attack started. So we need protection for those people, for them to feel safe in doing what they're doing. We have plenty of resources in this environment for meeting, and we own the places ourselves. So it's not that we didn't have space to meet, it's just we didn't feel safe in the meeting. We felt under attack in our own community, and we felt worried that we were going to be targeted. So the Gardaí need to start, something has to happen there, and social media needs to get a grip. I mean, really, it's really not right that this is allowed to continue and infiltrate the whole of social media, because it's just not good enough.
Just on that last note, I was very pleased to hear this morning that lawyers for the Rohingya minority in Burma are taking a multi-billion suit against Facebook for facilitating the genocide against them. And more power to them, and I look forward to them taking a hefty chunk out of Facebook for their nefarious work in this area. Because it clearly, I mean, the Facebook, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The social media platform's business model is at the heart of this and creates the conditions within which the far right can thrive. And I think I take both of your points there, that, you know, on the one hand, we need to be fighting for, rather than altering our messages, we need to be fighting for the material, for addressing the material conditions within which the far right can thrive, namely, as Mark said, namely the material need for people to have accommodation, safe housing. We need to be connecting our opposition to the far right to a demand for decent accommodation for everybody.
We also, I mean, who's going to do that fight? Because that's what I'm saying. While we were fighting the far right, we were also fighting the system to get help. So somebody needs to take that fight on, because we have enough to be doing.
Well, it's also just worth saying, I think that we have a shift that's necessary for the progressive forces and, I suppose, left organizers. And it's really quite crucial at the moment, because we could be looking at for the first time in our history having a centre-left government the next time that happens. But one of the things we need to do is we need to remove ourselves from the politics of competing for scarce resources. Now, I'm not talking about climate change, but we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So if our politics are about various groups competing with each other over scarcity, there's a real issue there. That it's neoliberal capitalism providing the conditions for which these fascist movements can thrive. And one of the ways to counteract that is that we're absolutely not living in a position of scarcity. So the state is spending a fortune on housing. It's just spending it in a neoliberal capitalist model where it's going to private, where it would prefer. And I mean, that comes through all our systems. It goes in the housing, in the HAP payments they're paying landlords. It goes in the direct provision system where they're paying hotel owners. It goes in. So basically, the idea that we have a scarcity of houses is because we have a policy problem. The policy problem wants a scarcity of houses, and that we need to start getting I think just getting our act together to say, no, we want all the good stuff actually. And if we can't have all the good stuff, if there's some reason, for example, the restraints of climate change, which mean we can't have all the good stuff, let's have the discussion about which good stuff let's have that discussion. And I don't see a place where it's happening, because again, I see that we're siloed. But I just want to come in very quickly because I'm really wary about hate crime legislation. I'm so wary about it, you wouldn't believe. While I accept something needs to happen, I think that if we look at the recent actions of An Garda Síochána and of police forces around the world, they're possibly more likely to be enablers of fascism than they are to be preventers of fascism. And so before, just wondering what those power bases are, before entrusting people with a further transfer of power to them, let's analyze whether that's where the power should be. I think possibly taking it away from the Garda Síochána and having it in some form of an ombudsman system, which is effective and provides redress and provides a remedy for someone who's experienced it, something along the lines of the kind of workplace relations or something like that might be better than within the criminal justice system. Given that caveat, I know Shane and loads of people have been working on this for a long time, and I know that we need protections for those who experience hate speech, but I just think we need to be very careful what we wish for and who it will be used against. That's the trouble, so when am I in danger of being, if I call someone a fascist who is a fascist, am I in danger of them being guilty of having breached the hate crime legislation, if I can't properly define what fascism is, and so those are I think the dilemmas on the other side of it. The minute we we have seen all of the kind of restraints and constraints we have, they tend to be used more strongly on working class communities, on communities of color, and on those already vulnerable. So before we bolster, I think, our security apparatus, we need to make sure that it's not going into a system that unfairly already targets those. So that's just something I'd say I have qualms about it. So
yeah, as somebody who has been looking at this question of hate crime, and I'm very clear to distinguish between hate crime legislation and hate speech legislation. The INAR isn't calling for hate speech legislation, because but also understanding that these things that we should be wary of giving more power to a police force, which is largely unaccountable and undemocratic. And I think that we should be looking at ways to make police forces more accountable to the communities which they serve. And I am concerned about the piece of legislation that's currently going through the Oireachtas, the An Garda Síochána Powers Act, which the policing authority and the ICCL have expressed reservations about. And so I take all of your points, and I think that for hate crime legislation to be effective and to be meaningful, it must be restricted to protecting communities and individuals who are susceptible to forms of violence. And that's the challenge there. But anyway, that's a discussion maybe for another day.
Well, I'm just coming at it as a punter. I'm coming at it as a punter. Yeah. My dad was a guard. As far as I'm concerned, that's what I'm going to for protection. So surely
I think Theresa raised a real question though. It is what is the response to if local community organizing is people feel unsafe? And I think calling the police is one response. I think there are other kind of responses and ways of trying to think through what does it mean whenever kind of our communities feel under attack, and that what are the ways that we can better empower ourselves around that. And I think they're kind of conversations that we probably want to be having. Is that we don't have a default kind of like, and it's, you know, I don't think the default necessarily should be called the police. Like it's like I think it's thinking through what does kind of community defense look like, or what does, like, you know, what are the roles of different organizations in terms of like a trade union movement or whatever else as well, like in terms of like being able to robustly defend our spaces, I guess, you know. And to a large degree, those are kind of questions yet to be teased out. But I think there's definitely something that we need to be engaged in collective conversations in.
We're coming close to the end here, and we have an unanswered question here from Lynn and Lismore. So I'm just going to read it out very quickly. The far right have identified our rural community, and their access to finances allows them to print and circulate professional-looking leaflets, currently using iRexit and freedom as their populist messaging. How do you counteract messages that may have an appeal to some when there isn't a community fund for response and no specific activity to rally around? So a very practical question there that we might finish on.
Just if I could come in quickly on that, some of those responses don't need to, you know, they don't need to cost a lot of money, right? Just in terms of the real simple stuff. So, you know, finding yourself the expertise and putting together a kind of an infographic on the correct information, asking all your friends to share that on social media, you know, those kind of things. For example, like, you know, I'll just give you one example now. I again, I have qualms about it, but like as the opposition for the direct provision centre in Ennis was being attempted, the people were being moved in there just around Christmas time. So one of the things we did is we put a call out for Christmas presents for the men who were going to be put in the, you know, nice Christmas presents, everybody to contribute to Christmas presents. And the promotion of that, you know, the PR around that immediately started to drown out the rest of it, because people, you know, it was just a really easy thing people could get involved in, they could do it. Now, I mean, there's other things to discuss about that, you know, model of the host community being the givers, and people, you know, just the framing of migrants within that is something I'm slightly uncomfortable with. But at the same time, as a tactic to get the far right out of the way, it worked perfectly, because hundreds of people got involved then. But it didn't actually cost us personally any money. It did cost us time. And, you know, one of the things that I'd say in the circumstances that we're talking about, where Theresa says that I was key, it was our access to resources as an organization that exists there that's key, you know. So like, we have a printer, we have a, you know, we have so, you know, basically I suppose we just have resources as a community organization there. So tapping into one of your positive community organizations and explaining what's going on is really worthwhile. You know, if there's a community development company, if there's a traveller support group, if there's whatever groups are in your area like that, I think that if you can contact them and go, look, I want to do something about this, and see will they help you, because, you know, at the least, you know, lots of us are underfunded, but at the least we can print up a few flyers if we need them, you know. So that kind of thing, it is there, and you know, I suppose our networks can compensate for the resources of that other communities may be able to tap. That's it really. The other last thing I'd say is that just an aspect of the far right in Ireland is the one thing that I see that they all have in common is the grift, the absolute grift. Every single one of these guys are fundraising, guys and women are fundraising big time. So they're asking, and in a way, once people fund something, they start to feel part of it as well, you know, so they're asking for a way for people can feel part of it. So if you look at, we were kind of doing the same thing, except we weren't grifting. We were going, here's a way you can go yourself, take some action and be part of something. And I think that that's possibly, COVID hasn't helped us because we've retreated to our houses and different things, but that way of asking people to be involved in something is the best inoculation, really.
And I had an answer to that too, is we debunked a lot of the information that was put on those flyers and used social media to share it, but also local radio stations and local newspapers. They really got involved in these stories and were very good with allowing us a platform to share that information, and we were able to debunk it. The other thing was the PPN. Yeah, we were left with no, you know, you need insurance to group and things like that, and you want to host tea and all that sort of thing. It's all about funds coming from the people that are already put upon. So, you know, we didn't get much assistance on the ground financially to do stuff.
Mark, any last words?
Last words. Well, I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation because it's like, I think they're kind of useful ones to be continuing offline, I think, as well. There's lots of knowledge out there. There's lots of experience, I guess, between us all, and obviously with the participants in previous conversations. So, yeah, and I think that it's remaining kind of like cautiously hopeful and optimistic. You know, it's like we're, you know, if we're in it for the long haul, grand, but also recognizing the sort of understanding the sort of the practices that these people get up to, what the groups get up to. It's, you know, we can sometimes like miss what we know already, and get sort of the sort of knowledge and tools and bits of resources that are under our own hands, you know, and trying to find ways to work and share that a bit better, I think, is kind of key. And that's why, yeah, I'm quite grateful to the folks at Maynooth for kind of pulling this together. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to say that I mean, I think your last point there about capturing the knowledge and acknowledging the knowledge that you do have. I think I was very struck that all three participants today, Theresa, Sarah, and Mark, all downplayed their expertise and their contribution to this fight. I would happily dispute that and really say that I congratulate you, and it's been a real pleasure and a real honor to chair these proceedings and to be able to take part in this conversation. And I congratulate the colleagues at Maynooth as well for this initiative. And I'm coming away from this feeling enriched, and I hope that listeners feel as enriched as I have by this as well. And I look forward to us having more such discussions, many more of these, as we carry on the fight against the far right. Thank you all very much for your contributions. Keep up the great work.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks.